Hey there, Sapdelf. What epic quests await us today?
Greetings! Today's journey leads us to the land of kernel updates.
Then let us arm ourselves with coffee and backups. Where do we start?
We start with a few words on theory, a crucial step that no adventurer should skip. But, if any of our viewers are particularly impatient and only wish to witness the upgrade itself, they can fast forward to where the backup begins. Links to all sections are in the description.
Then let's start with the question, what is the kernel?
The SAP kernel is a crucial component of an SAP system, serving as the intermediary layer between the operating system and the SAP applications. It's responsible for managing the system's core operations, communication, and processing activities, essentially functioning as the engine that drives the SAP system. The kernel contains executable programs and libraries that are essential for the system's runtime. This includes programs that handle various fundamental operations like database and network communication, including encryption, application processing, memory management, and much more.
How about explaining it a bit more clearly, maybe with an example?
More in practice? Think of it this way. The kernel is a collection of programs and libraries necessary for them to run. Anything operating at the OS level in the context of the SID-ADM user is very likely part of the kernel. Take a look at the programs running in my sandbox. Apart from the last four, which belong to my session, the rest are kernel processes. We have Start Service, ENQ Server, Message Server, Gateway, ICM, and work processes here.
Yes, I recognize them. We've already had a video on the channel that explains the ICM and work processes in great detail.
Exactly. It's worth checking them out. Also, take a look at the open ports on the SAP server. They're all managed by various kernel programs.
Yes, I recognize the ports as well from the video about the firewall and SAP ports. The SAP kernel is a powerful component of the system.
Absolutely. That's why it's so important to understand it and keep it in good shape. Updates play a big role in this, and that's exactly what we'll be discussing today.
Where does such a process start?
A diligent administrator starts with planning, keeping in mind that we begin with the lower systems in the landscape, and end with production after thorough testing. The technical steps start with creating documentation, and the first step to document is checking the current version of the kernel.
In the system, right?
Yes, that's one way to do it. And it's always where I start. After logging in, I select the System menu and choose the Status option. Then, I need to click the button at the bottom to view the kernel information. I'm most interested in two things: the kernel release and patch level. Besides that, it's always worth checking if the database library version and patch level are consistent with the kernel.
Kernel release 789 and patch level 200.
Yes. Remember that because it will be needed. My S4 HANA-like sandbox is based on the 2022 version. This information will also be needed when we select the new kernel.
You mentioned that this is one way of checking the kernel version. What's the other one?
You probably remember the episode about the dispatcher and work processes. Dis plus work is one of the core kernel programs. After running it, I can check the version. The kernel release is 789. Exactly as it showed in the application. The patch level is also consistent at 200.
Okay, so now we know the current kernel version. The question now is, which version can we update to? Do we always choose the latest one?
Before we answer that question, it's worth starting with the compatibility of kernel releases with various SAP systems. The PAM tool is helpful here. PAM means Product Availability Matrix. It's easy to find. Every major system update or migration should start with this tool. It may not be necessary for a simple kernel update, but it's good to know about, which is why we're looking at it. First, I need to search for my product. Let's say it's S4HANA 2022. My S4 has been found. I need to click on the name to open the details. Now I'm interested in Technical Release Information tab. The easiest way to check available kernel releases is in the Database Platform tab. My architecture is Linux on 64-bit x86. As you can see, only two kernel versions are compatible, 7.89, which I currently have, and 7.93.
So we'll choose the latter since it's newer?
Not so fast. We don't change the kernel line just because a newer one is available. We'll get to the options later. For now, let's look at an interesting SAP note. I need to search the note about SAP kernel versions and patch levels.
Is it more important than the product availability matrix?
Maybe not more important, but more detailed. That's what I was looking for. The first result. This note fits my case exactly. I want to use the kernel in one of the given versions, and I'm looking for recommendations on which release and patch level I should use. In the long list of systems, I need to find my S/4HANA 2022.
Here it is.
Yes, right here. The first option matches my case. For existing installations using kernel 7.8.9, I should use the same release with patch level 300. The second case is for new installations, where we choose the newer release only if we need an innovative kernel.
In that case, we'll stick with the current release, but we need a higher patch level.
Yes, indeed. So let's take a look at the release note for patch level 300.
Should we always check the release notes before an upgrade?
Yes, it's best practice. The note describes the changes since patch level 200, which was the previous major kernel stack SP. This covers exactly what our update involves. There are new features here that may be less relevant to us, but it's worth reading through. It's also worth checking what new parameters have been added. However, what we should definitely pay attention to are the known issues. As is often the case, the release note refers us to another document where known issues are added.
I don't like being redirected from one note to another to another to another.
Nobody likes it. It's good if you don't get caught in a loop. In any case, it's worth reading this note. For this version, there's not much, but it could happen that something needs to be discussed with the people responsible for the application. Or, for instance, be prepared for a potential issue so you're aware of its origin if it appears.
To stay vigilant?
You could put it that way. Knowledge is power. However, since we're on the topic of SAP Notes and making choices, it's also worth mentioning DCK.
DCK?
Downward compatible kernel. Take kernel 793 for example. The DCK note for it is provided here.
What's this about?
Kernel releases have their own life cycle. SAP doesn't maintain them indefinitely. From time to time, it designates a version as DCK for older kernel lines, meaning we need to change the release if we want to keep support and security. This is exactly such a case. Version 793 can be used as a replacement for 3 older kernel releases, starting from patch level 100. This note explains exactly how to do it and what the implications are. Of course, this isn't the main topic of this video, but since we're talking about the theory, it was worth mentioning downward compatible kernels.
I'm guessing this isn't the end of the lecture yet. What else is worth knowing before we get to the work we enjoy?
Version numbers, types of updates, and strategies. Then we'll move on to the practical part. I promise.
Okay, let's go.
SAP numbers kernels starting with the main version, followed by a subversion after the dot. However, it's very common to see it written without the dot. For each kernel release, patch levels are issued and assigned sequential numbers. Major releases, SP stack kernels, are marked in whole hundreds, even if previous numbers haven't been used.
So for example, could 200 come after 123?
Yes, exactly. Additionally, it's good to know that subsequent patches only start at the full 10 after the 100 mark, for example 110 or 210. Lower numbers are reserved for so-called emergency corrections to SP stack kernels. In such cases, an emergency patch replaces the main release.
You also mentioned something about types.
Yes, in the kernel directory, we'll find 3 types of files. The largest are the full kernel releases. These are divided into database-independent files and additional files specific to a particular database. Although, in the case of S4, only HANA is supported, which simplifies things a bit. Besides that, we have dis plus work archives. This is the most crucial part of the kernel, and therefore changes more frequently than others. Additionally, we encounter individual tools or groups of tools replaced when needed, without having to release an entirely new kernel version.
And when should we actually consider changing the kernel?
The strategy proposed by SAP is simple. If it's not broken, don't fix it. And if you need to patch, stick to major versions when possible. However, I have to add that it's not always that straightforward. Nowadays, security considerations also need to be taken into account. And in more complex environments, dependencies between various interconnected systems are also a factor.
All right, shall we move on to the practical part?
As you wish. Now we can. First, we need to download the kernel. I really don't like searching through the categories in the SAP software catalog. So I'll open the kernel release note to immediately find the link to the right place in the catalog. Yes, this is the kernel I'm looking for. On the right side, there's a link to the appropriate category in the catalog.
That's definitely faster than searching through the entire tree.
The rules are still the same. You always need to make sure the correct platform is selected. In my case, this is Linux on x86. As I mentioned, there are two types of files we need to download: database-independent files and those specific to particular software. I'll need the database-independent files first, and then SAP HANA. Let's take a look at the database-independent files for now. I'm looking for SAP XE version 300. Got it. Let's see what else is here. The SP kernel stack version 200 has been replaced by emergency release 201, so the faulty version is no longer available. At the very top, for example, we have the dis plus work package version 312. A bit further down is R3 trans version 310.
I can read the versions now. Let's download what's needed.
As you wish. I'm selecting what the SAP Note recommends, which is kernel 789 patch level 300. For now, the database-independent part is downloading. But we always need two parts in the same version. That's why I'm selecting the SAP HANA version of the files. Here, the choice is smaller. The first file on the list is the database library, but the rest are kernels in various versions. Here, for example, is the emergency version 201. However, I'm only interested in 300.
So we already have both parts of the kernel. Do we need anything else?
Since we're not downloading any hotfixes, we don't need anything else. However, we do need to know where to unpack this kernel.
I'm guessing it's where the current one is, so into the kernel directory.
Very well guessed, but which of the two?
Are there two?
You could say that. In my experience, this is the most frequently misunderstood part of the whole process, and often a configuration mistake in SAP systems.
I'm guessing you'll show how to understand this in practice?
Yes. Let's go to the profile directory. The SAP PF-PAR program allows us to evaluate the effective value of a parameter for a given profile. I'm interested in the instance profile and a parameter called dirctrun, which points to the kernel location. Remember this path, because this is my kernel directory. Notice that it includes the platform name, Linux x86.
Can we see what's in there?
Sure, to add to the theory, we can look at the contents and a few example programs. As you can see, there are quite a few files. For example, here we have sapcpe, which I'll talk about shortly. There's also the familiar SAP control, which we discussed in the episode on system startup. Here's msmon, used for monitoring the message server, the gateway file responsible for RFC communication, clean IPC for clearing shared memory segments, and, of course, the important R3 trans program. These are, of course, just examples to get a sense of what we'll find here. Now let's go to the work directory to check the sapcpe program logs. This is a program for copying executables. You'll easily notice that our kernel directory is listed as the source, but there's also a target. The source is the folder containing the distribution version of our kernel, which includes the platform name, as in heterogeneous systems we can have kernels for different platforms. The second directory, however, is the local instance directory, where the kernel is copied each time the system starts.
Why was it made so complicated? Wouldn't one folder have been enough?
It's not complicated. It has practical significance. First, changing the kernel across the system simply involves updating it in one place, and then all instances copy the files over upon restart. As a result, this directory is typically located on a network file system. Once instances copy it to local disks, access to these critical files is much faster. This was even more important in the past when shared file systems were considerably slower. Let's confirm that the same files are in the local kernel directory.
Yes, it looks familiar.
Let's take a look at my SAP Systems processes then. From the episode on work processes, you probably know how they operate. Take, for example, work process 14. Its process ID in the operating system is 3108. Linux allows us to view some details related to a running process through a special directory called /proc. Each process has its own representation there. I'm interested in two special links. CWD points to the current work directory of the process, while XE is a link to the executable file. As you can see, they indeed refer to the local kernel directory. This confirms that the system operates as I explained, and that SAP CPE is necessary.
So, as I understand it, we have two directories. We can place new files in the kernel directory and check everything, then restart the system, and each instance will copy the files to its own local directory. After the restart, the system will run with the new kernel version.
Yes, you understand it well. Now I have a question for you. Before each update, you need to back up the kernel directory. Which of these two directories would you back up?
The source one.
Very well. Let's do it. It's usually better to back up as the root user, although it's not strictly required. Most people back up files by copying the kernel directory, but I prefer the tar command. It gives me a single file that's easy to move if needed, takes up less space, and if necessary, restoring is just as easy as copying. You can find more about tar in the video on useful Linux commands. I use three options: Z to compress the file, C to create, and F to specify the file name. I always include the date in the file name, although it's also worth considering adding the kernel version. I make the backup of the entire directory, and for convenience, I save the file nearby. That way, it's easy to locate if we ever need to roll back to the previous version.
In that case, the rollback is just unpacking the archive, right?
Yes, just unpacking and restarting the system. Of course, we try to avoid this, especially on a production system. That's why we always start the update on a lower environment and test thoroughly.
Yes, I know. And the desired state is full kernel version consistency between systems within one landscape. That's clear to me.
All right, the backup completed without error. Let's take a look at the output file.
Around 500 megabytes.
Yes, not too much. Now I could replace the kernel and restart the system. But whenever time isn't absolutely critical, I first stop the system and start services, and then replace the kernel.
Do we need to stop the start services as well?
Yes, it's recommended. Keep in mind that the kernel also includes the start services server, so a restart is needed to load the new version. But as always, we check the system status before restarting or stopping. Both instances are green, so I can stop the system.
It's probably worth reminding here that if viewers have any trouble understanding the process of stopping or starting the system, it's a good idea to spend some time watching the dedicated video on this channel. And since we're on the topic of the channel, it's always worth mentioning that most viewers don't subscribe the SAP channel. This way, it's easy to miss a valuable video where the SAP basis magic happens. So, I strongly encourage everyone to click the subscribe button below this video. And of course, give it a like. It supports the channel and provides feedback that these kinds of videos are needed.
The application instance is already stopped. Same with ASCS.
Remember to stop the start services.
Yes, I remember. I need to do this for both instances, 00 and 01.
Both are stopped. What's next?
Now the actual kernel update operation. The files we downloaded earlier are in the /tmp directory. I'll unpack them using the sapcar command. But first, I'll change my location to one level above the kernel directory. Now I'll use sapcar. The X option is for extraction. F specifies the file, and J forces file replacement. The -R option is important to me as it specifies the target directory. Done. The database-dependent part is unpacked. I'll do the same with the second file. Its name is similar, just without DB. This file is always a bit larger, which is why unpacking takes longer.
It's been alertly extracted.
Yes, I'll check the contents of the kernel directory now. It's always good to take a look at file permissions.
The files are definitely newer, but the permissions look pretty standard. I don't see anything suspicious.
I agree. There's definitely one thing we need to do related to the kernel upgrade, but it's completely standard. It's about ICMBND. The program is distributed in an unusual way. Its name in the source kernel is changed to ICMBND.new. Only running the Saproot.sh Script copies this file to the correct name, changes its owner, and sets the set UID bit. This action is necessary if we want the SAP system to open ports below 1024, which on Linux require root privileges. Parameter for this script is SID of the system.
So this script changes the permissions of various files where needed?
Yes, for ICMBND it's copying and setting the set UID bit, but more files may be processed as well. One important note here: if you're actually using ICMBND, you need to check whether it's been copied to the local dir executable. It probably hasn't. sapcpe has limited capabilities with files that have a changed owner. You'll likely need to run the script again in the target directory. There are SAP Notes on this topic.
Got it. Shall we start SAP?
Why not? We need to launch the start services for both instances first. 00 started. The same for 01. Now the whole system.
Okay, it will take some time.
Yes, but in the meantime, we can check if sapcpe is working. This operation is performed at the beginning of the startup process. I want to find statistics in the log about the files that were copied. sapcpe only copies files that have changed, but with a new version it should be the majority.
Indeed, 160 out of 185 files were copied.
Here is the information.
What's next? Are we done now?
Yes, the technical part is complete. Now we just wait for the system to finish starting up, and we'll check if the correct kernel version is visible. Then, testing will remain.
All green.
Yes, let's check the kernel version. Everything is perfect. Patch level 300, just as expected. Of course, the kernel release also matters, which should be checked just in case. 789, everything's good.
Anything else?
Yes, we always double-check the kernel version from within the SAP application to ensure we replace the kernel in the correct directory.
Is it possible to do it wrong?
Wizards live long and see a lot, and I've seen my share. So I always double-check. Compilation after replacing the kernel is completely normal.
Kernel 789 patch level 300, as expected.
Yes, everything is fine. System testing after this change still remains. Of course, Basis is also involved, for example in checking logs and dumps. However, it's important to note that testing is not solely the responsibility of Basis. The scope depends on the specific system or the business approach. Nonetheless, testing is always highly recommended.
And I recommend that each viewer writes in the comments about their experience with SAP and whether this video was helpful for his level of knowledge.
Yes, that would be great. May you always reach the kernel of the matter. See you next time.